Do I qualify for maternity leave pay? How many holidays do I have left? How do I file expenses? For ops leaders tasked with delivering more for less, HR Harriet really is a silver bullet. Harriet delivers instant answers to employees on people and operational questions 24/7 across the business, eliminating unnecessary time spent on frustrating administrative tasks. Harriet is People Operations AI that makes every person in your company more productive and gives your ops and people teams their time back. Interested in increasing productivity and decreasing operational costs? Visit hrharriet.com. That's hrharriet.com and get Harriet working for you today. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Operations Room, a podcast for COOs. I am Brandon Mensinga, joined by my amazing co-host, Bethany Ayers. How are things going, Bethany?
Not very well. I feel like this has been a year of highs and lows. So I was pickpocketed on Thursday in London. I was coming back from Manchester to meet some friends for dinner in Soho, and there was a mini landslide on the train tracks between Manchester and London. I don't know what a mini landslide is, but it means that the trains were moving very slowly. So I was getting in 45 minutes late. I had already cut it fine for dinner, so I was in a real rush, and I was clearly a target, like in retrospect. I have my backpack on, I have a big coat, I have my wheelie bag, I'm pushing through people trying to get to the restaurant as quickly as possible. And because London has had so many phone thefts right now, talking about it's in the news, I just felt like it was inevitable that my phone was going to get stolen. I bought my iWatch so that I would not have to take my phone out and be less of a target, and to do navigation on my watch. But I haven't figured out how to do navigation well on my watch. And it was 100% the navigation that got me. So I knew where I was supposed to turn down. I turned down, and it was just taking a really long time to get to the restaurant. And so I picked out my phone to make sure I was still where I was going. I'm like, kept further down, put my phone back in my pocket and zipped my pocket. And then going down the road, I'm kind of passing people. Everybody, it's Soho. People are slow. There's tourists. I'm annoyed. And somebody jostles me. And it maybe took a little longer of a jostle than normal, or I just somehow noticed this one. But I didn't think, oh, they've just stolen my phone. I was just kind of like, why is this person so close to me? Carried over Great Marlborough Street. And I was like, God, is this restaurant really that much further away? Stuck my hand in my pocket, or went to stick my hand in my pocket, and my zip was undone, and my stomach just fell. And I was like, fuck. And I put my hand in my pocket, phone gone. And then, of course, I look, and there's the restaurant. So rush in, get to my friends, and borrow one of their phones. And luckily, I have my husband's phone number memorized. The only number that is not a childhood phone number that I have memorized in my whole world. And the only reason why I have it memorized is because he hasn't changed his number since we started dating. And I used to have to call him from America and had figured out how to memorize it. Never thought that I would need it for not having a phone. So horrific disaster, losing a phone. So huge amount of admin and hassle with the phone. I won't go into all of it, but all I have to say are the staff at the Apple store are just so amazing. They must get paid really well, because compared to all the other retail people you deal with, like the Apple staff is just another level. I'd like to thank all of them when I was like nearly in tears trying to sort out my fucking phone. So I now have a phone, but I don't have a SIM. So I still can't do any 2FA. I'm still waiting for O2 to deliver me my SIM. And then I had to fill in the police report, one of the things that did not require two-factor authentication. And it was great to be able to fill it in like online and not have to call the police and do everything. And your name and where it happened and describe what happened. And then there's like a bunch of check boxes of things you have to fill in. And one of the questions is, what is your relationship to the crime? Something like that. And so it was, I am the victim, I am a bystander. And the top one is I'm a victim. And I was just like, oh, no. And so I read the list 4 times.
There has to be something else.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my God. And it was so hard for me to click, I am a victim. I'm like, it's fine. It's not really, But, technically, so I found that really hard to click the victim button, filled in everything. And also because of my Find My iPhone, I could put in an exact address where it disappeared and, the address of where it happened, the whole thing. And then the next day I got here's your case number. And then a couple hours later, and now your case is closed. We've looked at the CCTV footage, nothing obvious, nowhere to pursue this, done.
So we have got a great topic for today, which is a COO's journey to the Google exit. We have a wonderful guest for this, which is Shane Harris. He's the former COO of Cameo, which was acquired by Google in 2024. And he is now working at Google in operations and go-to-market strategy. So one little caveat to Shane. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties in the conversation whereby we didn't quite get to the Google exit part of it as much as we had hoped for the conversation. But that aside, I just wanted to, as usual, start with you, Bethany, in terms of our back and forth. And the first thought I want to drop on you is Shane had talked about bootstrapping, a culture of getting stuff done at Cameo, and a bit of this no frills, more with less attitude. Do you think the finance CO person and that finance voice, perhaps more broadly, is undervalued? And now it is being valued with our current circumstances that we have.
Once you raise a bit of money, you need somebody who's a grown-up to control that money and make sure you don't do stupid things. So there's obviously the basics of getting your accounting right and your cash collection right and making sure people pay you. I'm actually surprised the number of companies that don't have their accounts payable set up and don't really know who is and isn't paying them and don't have conversations with their customers about, if you're not paying us, you don't have the source anymore. Like, I think a lot of startups, every customer is so hard won that even a customer that's not paying somehow counts as a customer, and you don't want to take it out of your numbers. I'm working with a company, not Peak, a different company, where that exact scenario has just happened. And they're like, we just want to clean up some churn. And then their churn cleanup were customers that have just never paid. I'm like, I don't think this is churn. Like, this is stuff that just should not have been counted in your numbers, full stop. And they don't have a finance person. I guess for me, that's a perfect example of, you need those checks and balances. You can't just rely on the glory of growing your MRR or your ARR without making sure that it's actually translating into cash. And if it's not translating into cash, what are you going to do about it? And that's just like a fundamental. That's not even advanced finance, but that's kind of the first thing you need. And then you need somebody who is creating a budget, managing a budget, explaining to people why they can and cannot have things, and make sure that the money is being used appropriately. And also something that finance, at least in my experience, finance should do rather than the COO or ops, is the reporting. I actually prefer reporting to be with finance rather than with ops, because it's like, for me, the more trustworthy, because even ops has skin in the game around how things are going to look and maybe cutting metrics in a slightly more flattering way. Whereas I just trust the finance people are like, this is the definition. I have run it through the definition and this is the metric. It's good or it's bad. Financial metrics or pipeline metrics or whatever. Plus finance tend to be really good at visualizing data and making stuff understandable.
He also spoke about, from day one, at the outset, kind of like Mark Farnell, making sure that you take your data hose and make sure that it's clean and wrap your process around it and carve your metrics out according to whatever that process is in a way that's meaningful and helpful to the business. And I'm just wondering what you make of that in terms of his view that it should happen from the very beginning and culturally set that, because oftentimes in companies, they don't want to spend the time and effort to do this up front. We just need to get customers on board and sell effectively to get the ARR rolling, and we'll deal with this afterwards. So I'm curious that balance between upfront versus later.
We see this all the time, and I get it, because most founders and founder CEOs don't care about metrics. They live 5-10 years in the future. They have a vision that they're trying to get to. The boring metrics along the way just are slowing them down as an archetype. And so you do end up not looking at numbers, or on the whole, companies don't look at numbers till really late, until they have to, pre-A, post-A, depending on how they gather their A round, where they like realize they need to somehow prove that they have traction. And they, other than the ARR, they have no proof of traction or proof of forward traction. And so if you're at the point where you want to move from founder-led sales to sales leadership, you need to be able to put those numbers in place, because otherwise, how are you going to tell whether or not you've hired a good leader? Is your pipeline growing? Are your cost of acquisition acceptable? And at that point, you should hire in RevOps or BizOps or whatever kind of ops you want to call it, depending on how broad people are looking. The ops systems thinking person is like, you should do it from day one and build it into the culture. But then both the realist and also there's a lot of things you have to fix in the beginning. I was like, does it actually just slow you down? Particularly if you're doing enterprise sales. If you're doing high volume sales, you need to do it from the start. Or if you're doing product-led sales, you need to do it from the start. Or product-led growth, PLG, because then it's all about metrics and you have enough numbers to make a difference. If you're selling £500,000 ACV or dollar ACV deals and you're selling 4 a year, your metrics really don't matter because there's nothing repeatable there for a very long time.
It's almost like a descending scale, isn't it? Enterprise, mid-market, SMB, PLG. As you go down that pathway, the earlier you have to start in terms of tracking this stuff in a way that actually makes sense for the business. But I think at the end of the day, what I've seen over and over again is that the Series A, when the company grows to a certain size, and as you're getting towards that Series B, and the founder is starting to not lose control, but they don't know what's going on in the business. They don't know what everyone is doing as they used to. And they start freaking out a little bit. And they're like, Brandon, I just want to see a dashboard, one dashboard that tells me what's happening. So that's where that flip of the switch, I think, really happens in a substantial way, where the CEO that maybe would not have been behind it earlier gets behind it because they're feeling like they're losing control. They need to see a dashboard. And that's the point by which you can actually step into to make something happen.
And that's when you can get the data to be accurate. Because up until that point, no matter how accurate you'd like the data to be, everything's on a spreadsheet somewhere hidden. And HubSpot is empty or randomly half used, and there's no information in there. And so you have to go and actually start to enforce data quality.
I cannot tell you the number of times I've seen HubSpot being licensed and just kind of sitting there.
And then you also have nobody in the business who knows how to use it.
Exactly.
You have somebody who's kind of like a little bit systemsy, has maybe watched one demo, has done things and customized a little bit of it in a strange way. It's not working. And then they just revert to the spreadsheet.
I always find the attitude funny because on the one side of it, they're always like, well, we know we need to have HubSpot. So they license it and they're like, okay, well, we got it now. And then they just kind of ignore it. And then at some point when things start to like really go haywire at some stage in terms of just not knowing what's happening in the business, they're like, oh, okay, we should actually do something. And then that RevOps hire happens, then the cleanup happens, then the tracking happens, then the metrics happen, and the culture piece of sales reps actually doing stuff properly happens.
Or it doesn't, where they hire the RevOps person and the rest of the culture change doesn't happen. And you have this RevOps person who's just banging their head against a wall, trying to change the culture, and nobody else goes with it.
I mean, this is where the operator comes in, doesn't it? Because oftentimes these RevOps people are fabulous, but they're not great communicators. They're not great at change transformation in the business. And if you're sitting there with 25 reps or 30 reps, nobody's going to do jack unless they're in a well thought out transformation program to get them in a place where they understand why it's useful. They're being held to account, and it's not going to be the RevOps person that does that. It has to be somebody else.
And also sometimes they're perfectly fine communicators. They're just not senior enough. When the CEO's like, I don't care about it, I never look at it, here's my spreadsheet, nobody is going to listen to the RevOps person who's trying to get them to use HubSpot.
So here's another question for you, because I've also seen this repeatedly where the CEO of the company recognizes it needs to happen, he or she wants to do it, it starts happening in some form, but it's still kind of half-baked. And the message that I get back from the CEO is that I want reporting to happen, but I do not want to look at it in HubSpot. I hate those charts, and I'm not going to bother to log in.
I have also seen that one. You kind of get one or the other of either I don't want to log in, I hate the way it looks, can't be bothered, or gets really excited by it and drills in, but doesn't quite understand it and goes into like these weird like rabbit holes and misunderstandings. So I think there's two things. Either you work at getting them to like it and keep working at it, or accept that HubSpot is your database and you're going to export the information into pretty charts for that person on a regular basis, either weekly or monthly. And then that like refer back to the finance people who can make pretty charts. It's a bit of wasted time, but at least you have a good database at that point, even if the consumption of the information is not in the tool.
I think in the CEO case that I've experienced, taking that data that hopefully is good data that actually is clean to your point and tracked properly, you can export it and either visualize it in Excel, which people understand, or Google Sheets, or possibly start thinking about like things like Power BI and visualizing there. But I always find that's like just a whole other world of pain, to be honest. If you don't need to do it, then I think kind of in that A/B world, visualizing it outside of HubSpot and just Google Sheets or something like that is perfectly acceptable, I think.
I would not spend my budget on Power BI. Any spare budget I have, I'd be spending on AI tools for the company to just experiment with. In this new world of cash is not free and constraint, and where am I going to spend my IT budget? It would not be for a company that's Series A, Series B, maybe even Series C. I wouldn't be spending my money on BI tools anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's so many of those BI tools, and they're so expensive typically. Like you think about these things like Snowflake and Tableau, they are super, super expensive, like crazy expensive. And unless you're of a certain size and transactional scale, it's hard to argue that it makes any real financial sense, especially when people either don't use it, can't use it, or whatever does show up on those dashboards is not correct for all sorts of reasons. When it comes to metrics, what do you love? What do you hate? What gets Bethany excited when it comes to the world of metrics, and what kind of metrics?
I like to strip it back to the ones that really matter. So gross margin, are you making money or not? Payback period, are you making money or not? Those are probably my big ones. And then net revenue retention, because are you growing or are you standing still or are you going backwards because you can't retain customers? Everything after that is interesting to see how well the system is functioning and is the SaaS flywheel rolling. How about you, Brandon?
So I love the standard stuff, obviously. I splice and dice it to death in terms of ARR, year-on-year, quarter-on-quarter, month-on-month, growth rates that are attached to that, looking at the forecast and figuring out where our burn rate is, how it's tracking, and if you increase budget here a little bit or increase revenue there, how that affects the cash burn itself. So I like the cash burn as an actual thing to focus on. And obviously gross margin and whatnot, operating income are always quite interesting in this respect as well. Other ones of interest, for sure, we called it net dollar retention at Trent, my last company, but effectively, if you combine expansion, churn, all those other factors, are we incrementally growing our customer set from a revenue perspective, or are we starting to lose steam? And also looking at the cohorts of the subsegments within that is quite fascinating, because oftentimes you see very clear trend lines of like segment A is tanking it for some reason, segment B is kicking ass, and just understanding what that difference looks like, what kind of customer sets are maybe not entirely suitable, and you can kind of see it where they're not growing at the other rates of the other customers, and there's a reason for that, and digging into what that reason is, recognizing it's not the best customer set for you to be targeting, or that perhaps you need to be doubling down in that segment to actually bring forward more functionality or experiences to get them more excited by what's happening, perhaps.
So I've worked with one company that had a very traditional small, medium, large process, and the small were micro. And so it was all credit cards and it was low touch. But in the beginning, it was not low touch, but they were the ones that were turning on and off all the time. So it wasn't necessarily churn, but because it was a monthly subscription, they would turn it on when they needed it, turn it off. And so in the numbers, it looked like churn. So one of the first things I did was like really delve into what's going on, because they were going out for a fundraiser. Everybody's like, oh my God, you have all this churn. And by doing it into the cohorts, you could see that enterprise actually had a really strong expansion. Mid-market was fairly okay. And the churn, as we called it, was all in the small markets. And although they were small companies, they actually made up a large chunk of the revenue. And so it looked like it was all bad churn when you rolled it all up together. But by segmenting it and doing those cohorts, we could see what was actually going on. And then we focused on, there wasn't anything with the product that you could change. It was a structural issue. Like these customers just were not going to ever commit to a year. And so we focused instead on massively lowering the cost of acquisition and making it completely no touch, only credit cards. If somebody's credit card expired, immediately turn them off from the product. And therefore, we still had this really bitty revenue, but the profitability of the customers massively increased.
At my former company, we had exactly this, which is you had freelancers that would turn the software on and off depending on their workload and what was happening from a contract perspective. And you could very clearly see them, as we thought at the time, churning out, and then we could clearly see them reactivating at a later point. So we actually called that bucket reactivation. So it became a very clear bucket of trend within the forecast that we had certain expectations around reactivations, what that looked like, and just making sure that it was cleanly segmented from the churn number to ensure that investors understood.
And then you got some profitability out of it as well. Like if you make it no touch, low touch, you're not actually paying for it, then that's nice extra money.
What do you think of the rule of 40, combining profitability with growth as a thing?
It seemed like it was really, really trendy right after the tech crash. There was articles about it. Everybody's talking about it. And I think it's because it's come from private equity and it's a way of PE firms being able to value companies. Are you still hearing it?
Not as much. What I do think about is the ARR per FTE. So the amount of revenue that you're making divided by the number of employees that you have. It's a direct correlation of efficiency of like, do we need 30 people to get to this revenue level? Or is it 60 or 90 or 120? And how does that benchmark versus other companies in a similar category? It's quite a useful kind of benchmarking tool.
And also it'll be interesting with all of the AI being rolled out in companies, what the new benchmark will become. I read an article about AI and tech professional services or professional services like lawyers and accountants and consulting firms, the vertical professional services. And they were saying that because AI can do a lot of what juniors do, basically like a junior lawyer does just all of the shit work and now a machine can do it, that a lot of these organizations are not planning on hiring nearly as many graduates now. But then it's like kind of an existential issue of like, where do all of these kids go? And having children, I am a bit worried about this, like, where are their jobs in the future? But also experienced people are not worried about losing their jobs because they can see what is good and not good in AI and like where the hallucinations are. But what you're going to end up having is because we're not having the next generation trained on it, when the experts retire, you don't have people who are going to be able to tell what's good and what's not good. I also just thinking about like what's going to happen to tech companies in the future. Would you hire graduates? Like, I think if you have a company with a good culture that's growing steadily, companies might just kind of age together.
And not hire juniors, you mean?
And not hire juniors. Not just the PwCs and Accentures of the world, but across the board. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to the workforce in the coming years. What are we going to do with all of our kids if we don't hire them? We have to do something with them.
Yeah, but you're right. Especially for scale-ups, when you're being very efficient with your cash and only spending where you have to. If you don't need juniors to be in the business because you have AI doing a bunch of that stuff for you, then you're not going to, period. It doesn't matter what your values are of your organization.
It's taken us slightly away from metrics, but what we'll be able to do is measure the metrics. But it's interesting, it came from the ARR per head, this whole little bit of conversation. So reason why the metrics matter. And philosophically, what does it show us?
We are revving up the engine of the podcast and looking for a great brand to sponsor the show. We have over 7,000 listeners now across COOs, CEOs, founders, and operational professionals who are decision makers for all kinds of technology, including HR, planning, strategy, legal, and other tools.
It's Beth here. I just wanted to thank you for listening to the podcast, and we'd love to keep it going, but we're going to need to get some sponsors in order to do that. So if you work at a company that could benefit from speaking to listeners like you, or know of a company that might benefit, please send them our way.
To find out more, go to operationsroom.co/sponsorship. That is operationsroom.co/sponsorship.
Any startup, your number one goal usually is growth, right? Andrew and Al, original founders of Cameo, they read the market well in that they forecasted in the future. They could see that there was going to be a major impact from cloud on virtualization. So from day one, we actually knew that acquisition was a likely exit path for us. We didn't box ourselves into where that was the only exit path, but we knew that that was a very likely exit path. And then another piece of it was we looked at scaling, and every company has culture and core values, and something that we as an executive team really focused on I know that sounds silly, but we got things done and no frills, no hype, just all results focused in what we were doing. And do more with less was something that we were used to doing. And so part of our culture was being gritty, being scrappy, finding ways to get results and make things happen without getting involved in the hype and the waste. And, it was really interesting because at the time, money was so cheap. So there was this temptation to raise a Series A round. And, we actually had opportunity to do that at a pretty meaningful valuation. But when we took a step back, we just looked at it like the things that we're being asked to do, the expectation of growth at all costs and, hire a bunch of people, if things don't go wrong, you fire them all later, like it was a little bit counter to our culture. And what was crazy was like 6 months later, after we made that decision, the wheels fell off. Like the interest rates started going sky high. You had venture firms coming back and say, hey, you know what? You got to be profitable in your growth. You got to be cash flow positive. You got to show results for all this money you're spending, which that was something we cared about from day one. And it was part of our culture.
So the founders probably made as much by not taking funding as they would have had they grown a bigger company.
When you do the math, it's crazy. Just speaking in general terms, like what bootstrapping and being cash flow positive does is it preserves your autonomy so that you're never stuck in a situation where you have to raise money at a valuation you don't like, or, if the market takes a turn, you end up in a scenario where upside down. I mean, the scenario you described is like absolute tragedy to me. And it happens a lot where you have a very hyped up firm. We're going to hire a ton of people. We're going to get these crazy high valuations. We're going to pay wild salaries to the exec team. And then the market shifts or something happens, and 3 years down the road, they end up selling at still a very meaningful valuation. But in doing that, nobody made any money because of the way they financed their growth leading into it.
It's hard to make that call. And I think this is where it comes a bit to Brandon's question of, do you know what kind of exit you want? Because sometimes if you have that idea that you believe in, that is that unicorn idea, and you're going to create a category and you're going to take over the world, and that's your ambition, then it's really hard to not want to take the money and to feel the urge that if you don't move fast enough, somebody's going to come and steal your idea. And like the glory of being the next Salesforce, not that Salesforce is like exciting for anyone anymore, versus actually what I want is a nice amount of money for my children and my family and keep the autonomy and grow a business that I like.
And all those things are considerations. There's no one size fits all, but I think there's something beautiful about being, I don't want to use the word realistic, that sounds wrong, but being pragmatic about what you're doing, because there are a lot of visionaries out there, and the road, there's carcasses all along the path to becoming a unicorn. There's a lot of people that they go too hard when they should have just taken a more sustainable path, and it aligns to culture. I really think it aligns to personality, aligns to culture.
So when you think about the secret sauce of Shane Harris as the COO in Cameo specifically, what is it about Shane that really helped to make this happen?
The role of operations is to enable the strategic business objectives of the company. It's everything that is happening. You're helping the company get from A to B in the most efficient, effective way. A great COO is to have a way to combine everything the company is doing there's so much data flowing through your company. There's so much information to be harnessed by just your day-to-day processes and operations. And you need to establish performance metrics across the organization that tells you how the company is doing. And then also you have to put systems in place that fuel those metrics, right? So you're collecting the data that you need to collect to make the right decisions as a company, to be able to take risks and fail fast, to be able to optimize, to be able to determine what should we change to reach our strategic plan? What things do we need to adjust? You need to get out ahead of those things.
You're talking about systems as in more of the like supply chain as a system or a customer journey as a system rather than literally technology that you're putting in place.
It's actually both.
That's what I mean. Whereas I think people think systems like you're talking about whether you're using HubSpot or not. But what you're actually talking about is the system of the customer journey or the interconnectedness system that is the entire company.
So when I'm saying system, what I mean, you have a business process, right? You have work that needs to get done. and you put in place a process. Here's how that work is done. The system is what facilitates that process. It could be the technology that you're using. I mean, maybe it's a spreadsheet, but you have to have some framework, some structure around how you're doing your work, or else it's just chaos and nothing can be measured and you don't know why you're getting whatever results you're doing and everyone's scattered. And you can't scale that way. So a system is probably the combination of the technology, but also the process that you're following to get work done. And if you think through what are the metrics that I need to have when you're putting those systems in place, you're going to do it right. And you're going to have clean data. If you have the expectation that we collect this data as an organization, we have metrics that we follow and measure to. When you bring a sales rep on, you train them in the process for collecting the data. They're inputting the data, and it could be HubSpot, it could be whatever. And that's part of your culture because they see, oh, you're making decisions off of this, and that's how we're growing. That's how we're scaling. You make that available. You make metrics visible to everybody in the company. They understand from day one how important those things that people typically hate to do. I've had the luxury of working for CEOs that get it and that understand how strategic it is to a company to have that data on hand. I promise you, if you're having issues with the CEO, the second that you show them a real-time, live, just simple dashboard that shows them the metrics they care about, that answers the question. Every CEO, once you get past like 10, 20 people in a company, the CEO can't be involved in everything. They just can't. What drives them nuts is wanting to know how are we doing and why are we doing how we're doing, good or bad. That's the question that every CEO has. And in operations, you're answering that question. And if you build the system, the metrics, the flow with that in mind, to where you can give them real-time answers to that question, they're going to love you. And you won't have to fight them. They're going to be begging you for more because that's what you need as an executive to lead your business.
Did that help put you in a good place for the acquisition? So were you able to build business cases well? What was the integration like? Because I think some CEOs go, yeah, okay, I can have some metrics, but a story about how having good metrics means a better EV, that is probably more compelling for most CEOs I know.
If you're considering buying a business, right, you want to know, why is this business worth buying? And at the end of the day, whether you're raising venture funds, an A round, whether you're selling yourself to your I mean, this goes back to your question, how can operations be strategic to a company? Everything you do, it boils down to a mini business case. Why should we do this? What's the evidence that tells us that this is a good thing to do, whether it's internal, external data, but like, why are we making this decision? And how do we measure if this was a good decision or a bad decision and pivot? So coming into an acquisition, coming into raising funds, yeah, they want your data. They want to know all of your top performance metrics. Why are things going well? Why are they going poorly? They need an answer for, you need to know the metrics they're going to be looking at. You need to have a flow of data that honestly answers those metrics, but you also need to be out in front of it. You don't want to wait until you're trying to raise a round to put all this in place, because what's going to happen is it's going to boil up. Hey, wow, we had this weird blip over here. Why did we have that blip over there? And if your answer is, oh, I don't know, we just found it, you're going to look like an idiot. But if you can say, yeah, we actually recognize this dip in conversion rates on leads in Q1, and we knew that was going to hurt sales in Q4. And so what we did was, instead of doing this campaign, we shifted those funds into another campaign with higher conversion rates. And what happened is, as a result, sales in Q4, we nailed our forecast because we were 3 months ahead following the leading indicators. You show them that, and that just gives them confidence. It gives them trust. And that's your job as a COO, is to have all that information on hand and to have the story. But the story comes out naturally if you're following it in real time. It gets awkward and clunky, and people can smell the BS if it's something that you've not addressed until you're pulling the data last minute for somebody who's asking for it.
So if you think about what you just said, and you had to break it down in terms of stages of development with Cameo, in terms of what you did, just to give it a level of granularity as to what that looks like.
Coming back to strategic objectives, right? Like, the first thing I did when I came on is towards the tail end of a year. So we had the luxury of kind of measuring how had we performed, and then it was putting in place a forecast model that made use of our historical data, drew on external information of market sizing and all this, and industry metrics, and let's create a forecast model of what we're going to achieve as a business over the next 3 years. And what are the metrics that are going to tell us, like what assumptions are driving this forecast model? And you can piece all those assumptions out into metrics. And okay, so here are the assumptions we're making that's going to drive this forecast model. How do we measure those so that we know that we're on track for this forecast? Or do we need to shift things? Where do we need to shift things? And the forecast was dynamic in that not just was it applying to, hey, this is the goal we want to reach, but what are the pressure release valves and the ways to, we have X amount of funds right now where you've decided we're not going to raise money. So how do we use those funds to get us from A to B, which is this strategic objective, this goal that we're setting that's attainable, but it's a stretch. How do we deploy those funds in a way to get us there? Let's put in place metrics so that we know we're marching to that plan and we're using our resources to grow at the most sustainable possible rate, right? And we have like something that we did that was just really, really impactful is we had this dynamic budgeting process. You can't live in a world when you're bootstrapped and you're working to scale. You can't live in a world where you have a static budget and everyone can just spend money when they're not showing results, right? So we put in place a plan. That was like our document, right, that we're working off of as, spreadsheets, it's systems, it's metrics, but built that plan out, defined the metrics that would tell us how we're performing against it, and then modified our systems so that we could collect that data in real time and constantly see where we're marching. We meet as an executive team. We would meet weekly to review where are we on this path to our strategic objectives and how are we doing.
So we've talked a lot around building the operations for building the company. We haven't talked a huge amount about the exit. Looking back on what you've done, is there anything you would do differently? Or looking back at everything that you have done, is there anything you would do differently at your time at Cameo to put yourself in an even better position?
The time to prepare for an exit is 2 years before you actually are going to need to exit. The main things I would focus on just sharply, like make sure you have your data and your metrics there. Like ask questions about your performance. You need to be able to answer that. You need to have clean financials. It's so much better if you are internally auditing your data, auditing your financials, answering the hard questions as an executive team, as a COO, and then, the rest of the organization, so that you can be more than prepared and show you're prepared when you start having those conversations, those negotiations. The stuff we've been talking about, systems, metrics, forecasts, that applies directly to having a successful exit. The next thing I would say is, especially at startups, you don't want to spend a lot of money on legal. But the reality is that is such an important piece, especially when you start looking at getting acquired by a larger organization. So I would strongly recommend and spend the time to make sure your employee contracts are exactly where they need to be in industry standards. Spend the time to make sure all your customer contracts are where they need to be. Another one that's really big, and this is probably one of the hardest ones that I've learned, is not every customer is actually a good customer. You're so desperate for money as a startup. You're so desperate for customers to show growth that you're inclined to do things to just land an account that sometimes could come back to bite you. There's two things that could happen. One is you could find out that this customer segment that was easy to win early, right, is actually a higher churn customer segment that's not going to be as attractive to people you're raising funds from or to a potential acquirer. We had to take a step back and say, what customers do we really want? And a lot of times the early stage customers that you win to help you get your business off the ground are not the right customers to increase enterprise value long term. And you want to shift into those customers that give you the best growth and the lowest churn and the highest customer lifetime value to customer acquisition cost ratio. That's a metric I love. And then another thing I would just say is on the culture piece, like if something deviates from your culture, whether it's a hire, whether it's a strategic decision, an investment, if it just doesn't feel right, revisit that over and over again and be sure that that's something you really want to do before you do it.
It's quite interesting because you're talking about like so much of what you've talked about today is the metrics, follow the data, and yet follow your gut, your instinct, your culture is actually just as important, or if not more. And so it's a little bit of where's the art, where's the science?
So I would just say this: culture should guide your starting point decisions, right? Data will inform you how to pivot after you make those decisions. Rarely will you make the perfect decision or execute perfectly, right? So it's like your culture sets your goals, sets your vision, sets how you're going to operate as a business. Those are gut decisions, right? You're making, and then judgment calls where there isn't data to tell you this is the right answer, or sometimes maybe the data does say something and it just doesn't feel right because there's something else there that you haven't considered. But when it comes to this, like planning, measuring, optimizing, making sure everyone's accountable, every meaningful decision should be treated like a mini business case. Like you should be able to justify why you made that decision. And then a month down the road, why are you continuing on that path based off of how you're performing?
Before we end, I'd like to ask you the final question, which is, if our listeners can only take one thing away from our conversation today, what is it?
Make sure you have in place the systems and metrics that tell you your progress towards your strategic goals, right? It's worth the time to get that right because you need to know how you're doing against where you want to go. And you need to know that in real time so that you can steer yourself there. That's the role of operations. And in my opinion, the best thing operations can do is create that so that an organization can reach their strategic objectives.
Lovely. So thank you, Shane Harris, for joining us in the operations room. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment or subscribe, and we will see you next week.